Order. I thank the member for Fairfax. His time has expired. And I call the member for Dunkley.
Remember when former Prime Minister Morrison called his own government a Muppet show? You remember that? Seems he was right about one thing, right? Because honestly, the member for Fairfax has just given 15 minutes of inventing his own reality. That was an extraordinary speech which had nothing to do with what we're debating today, the actual legislation and the facts of what is happening in this world and this country to the climate. You know, if you wanted to stand up in this parliament and announce to everyone that you're a muppet, you'd give the speech that we just heard. This legislation puts into place Labor's climate change policy that we took to the last election. I have to admit that for the first, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes of the member for Fairfax's speech, I thought maybe there was a chance he was supporting the legislation, because it did set out the fact that we put before the Australian people the most robust climate change policy that has ever been put to the Australian people, that has been modelled by one of the most respected environmental economic firms in the country, and we put it to the Australian people well before the election with all of the detail so that they could scrutinise it, so that they could understand it, so that it would be clear when we went to the election on the 21st of May that if they were voting for Labor, they were voting for real action on climate change. They were voting for an emissions reduction target of 43% by 2030, for 82% of the energy going into the grid to be from renewable energy by 2030, and for, by 2025, as the member for Fairfax pointed out, energy prices to reduce. Not in the first 9 weeks of this government, the first 9 weeks where, by the way, what did we find out? Oh, that's right, that the government that the member for Fairfax was a member of hid from the Australian people before the election a report about energy prices going up. I mean, it's extraordinary. That's right. Thank you. The member for Paterson reminds me they changed the law so that they could hoodwink the Australian people about the situation about energy prices under their government. And imagine coming into this parliament and railing about the amount of gas that's available in the domestic market and the price of gas, and having a crack at a government that's been in place for 9 weeks when 9 years, member for Fairfax, 9 years. If only you had have been part of a government that had the opportunity to act on these things. If only. You clearly would have solved all the problems. It's just extraordinary that here we have an opportunity in Australia for the first time in almost a decade for people to come into this parliament and say to those school children who are up there watching me speak, we have your future in our minds. We have your future at the forefront of the decisions that we are making about how we deal with emissions, so that you can live in an environment when you're our age that somewhat resembles the environment we got to live in when we were your age. For the first time in a decade, members in this parliament have an opportunity to come into this place and say to the school children who are up there in our electorates, we have your employment future at the forefront of our minds. We are thinking about how to give you the opportunity to have well-paid, interesting, secure jobs in a renewable energy industry in Australia, which makes us a renewable energy superpower, and allows you to work in a way that gives back to the community as well as supports you and your family. Imagine, Deputy Speaker, having the opportunity to come in here and talk about these things to talk about the future of these children and instead come into this parliament and invent your own reality, pretend the last 9 years where there were 22 energy policies, none of which were implemented, never actually happened, and give a speech for 15 minutes that not once mentions the reality of climate change and the impact of emissions on our environment, on our health, on our jobs and on our future. Imagine squandering that opportunity. I really hope that the last person to do that in this parliament, in this debate, is the member for Fairfax. But I have a sneaky suspicion he might just be at the head of the cavalcade. The cavalcade of people that apparently did not listen to what the Australian people were telling them on the 21st of May when they turned up to vote. When the Australian people voted for 77 members of this place to be from the Labor Party that took a comprehensive climate change policy, when the people of Australia voted for a crossbench that campaigned on action on climate change and reduced the Muppet Show to a small group of people on the other side of the chamber, maybe you'd sit for at least a moment and think to yourselves, perhaps we're on the wrong side of history here. I mean, maybe they did, and then they thought, oh, I know how we'll fix it, we'll bring in nuclear energy, which blows everyone's mind that has ever thought about it deeply for any period of time.
More expensive.
I did come here wanting to give a really positive speech, but obviously the member for Fairfax ruined that for me. This is truly a moment in history. There aren't that many times, if we're all honest, in this parliament when we're debating legislation and issues that can fundamentally change the course of future, not just for our communities, not just for our country, but for our contribution to the region and the world. There are not that many opportunities. Well, there were none in the last 9 years whatsoever. But this is one of those opportunities. This is not about ridiculous things like green lawfare. And it shouldn't be about politics. It should not be about politics, and you can smirk and be smug all you like, but you are sitting on the wrong side of the chamber, and it looks like you're going to be sitting on the wrong side of history, because this is about the future.
Order.
Use the correct titles when referring to members of parliament.
Order. I think that is appropriate that people are given their correct titles. Thank the member for Dunkley. You can continue.
Thank you very much. This is a moment in history. Everyone in this chamber, everyone in the Senate has the privilege of having the opportunity to be on the right side of history. It's a privilege, it's a responsibility, it's an opportunity to listen to what the Australian public have been saying to us and to act in the way they want us to act. I campaigned hard on Labor's climate change policy in my electorate. I talked about the climate emergency and reducing emissions and a cleaner, better future. I talked about the employment opportunities that will come from becoming a renewable energy superpower. I talked about the fact that we can have a modern economy and be part of changing the course of the future for the better. And that's what my community voted for. That's what they voted for. And that's what this legislation will deliver. You know what this legislation also does? It imposes accountability on government and this parliament that we have never seen before. The member for Fairfax raised that the minister has talked about the fact that this legislation isn't necessary to set a target. Well, of course it's not. You know, we had all sorts of vague targets under the last government. You know what this legislation does? It holds the government to account for getting to that target. That's the part of the legislation he didn't talk about. He didn't talk about the part of this legislation that says that there has to be an annual address to the parliament by the Climate Change Minister to ensure that the Parliament of the day is required to update the Parliament and the country on the progress we are making to meet our climate goals. This legislation includes a mechanism to hold governments to account, including our government, because we believe in accountability and we believe in transparency, and we believe that if you say to the Australian people, we are going to do something, then you get held for account about whether or not you do it. You know, the Climate Change Authority will assess and publish progress against our targets and will advise the government on future targets. A Climate Change Authority that has expertise and responsibility and that will be restored to what it was meant to be after the damage that has been done to it over the last 9 years. Reasonable people can have a debate where they don't agree, and not everyone comes into this place with the same views about what the science says. But you can't anymore stand here and say that the science is wrong about the impact of the changing climate. You cannot live in our country and see the devastation of the bushfires and the floods. You cannot see the weather events that are supposed to be 1 in 100 years happening year after year with an intensity and an impact that is greater than we have ever seen before, and deny that the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere is impacting our climate, unless you invent your own reality. And we weren't sent here to invent our own realities. So I urge every member of this parliament to think about which side of history you want to be on, to think about how you will be viewed in the decades to come when the young people who are sitting up in that gallery watching this debate and the young people in our community are our age, and they are looking back at the decisions that were made that impacted the environment and the jobs and the economy that they inherited from us.